You know what's potentially more depressing about the American slide into authoritarianism than the fact that it's happening? Is that it may have been necessary. Now, how can I say that? Practicality. As a matter of political practicality, the president must be able to rule by executive order because many functions of the U.S. federal government are the purview of Congress, and because of the filibuster, Congress does not take them up. There isn't a realistic scenario where one party gets 60 Senate seats anytime soon, which means Congress is de facto non-functional. Laws do not get enacted in Congress anymore. Without executive orders, nothing would change in the United States outside of Supreme Court rulings and whatever gets chained to budgets and debt ceiling increases. The normal process of lawmaking cannot take place because of the filibuster. So as a matter of expediency, to push through a political agenda, you must use the powers of the president, using creative interpretations of statute and hoping the courts will let you get away with it, which is why judicial appointments become so politically critical. The difference is, while the president's powers have expanded massively over time, Donald Trump is the first to be sufficiently egotistical and unbound by perceived norms to actually exercise them to their fullest extent, and then challenge the courts to try to push that extent further. The alternative, much as we might like to avoid rule by decree, is that very little would change. Indeed, the role of the Supreme Court would be even more pronounced, since they would, through their rulings, be the only ones making law effectively. And when people perceive there to be problems to solve, you are never going to win them over by saying you will do nothing, because that's how the system works. People hate Congress. They have hated them for a long time. Even trash-tier presidents like Trump have higher approval ratings, and it's not hard to see why, given they're paid to essentially do almost nothing. One of the few things I've ever totally agreed with Trump on, alongside getting rid of daylight saving time and calling soccer football, was calling for the end of the filibuster so the Republicans could pass a budget by themselves. The useless cretins in the Senate balked at the notion because they put a higher premium on being able to stop the Democrats from doing anything than on being able to do anything themselves, even if that thing is literally giving the federal government the funds to actually operate. If the last budget kerfuffle had gone on much longer than it did, the Dems caved. Would anyone have seriously blamed Trump if he started using creative financing to keep things going on his own authority? Sure, it would further cement himself as a de facto autocrat, with all levels of government save the courts reporting to him, and the legislature being left abandoned, but what else could have been done? You can't expect federal employees, and most importantly federal law enforcement and the military, to go unpaid indefinitely. Rule number one of being a ruler is no one rules alone. You have to pay your goons, or they won't be yours any longer. I wrote the above before the Dems caved on the budget, but that doesn't really change anything. The problem persists, it just means the legislature hasn't totally abdicated its few remaining responsibilities yet. But they are few. Only on matters of absolute state survival, like the budget or debt ceiling, is the filibuster overcome. Normal votes on laws, nothing ever happens. And in any case, the fight may not be over. They only passed a continuing resolution. So unless the same 8 Dems cave immediately when this comes up again, we may have another shutdown in the new year. The Senate filibuster is a core dysfunction of the American system that is ruining it. A vast minority of the population is able to disproportionately affect policy via the Senate as it is. Thanks to the House, they're unable to force any positive agenda through on their own, but they are able to block opposing agendas. And the filibuster exacerbates that problem to the point of making lawmaking de facto impossible. And no one can order the Senate to eliminate the filibuster. So unless and until most of the Senate turns against it, it cannot be circumvented. The country can be held hostage by the will of at least 41 senators, no matter how few people they represent. Granted, the fact that the Senate can represent a minority of the population disproportionately is secondary, really. Even with that being the case, without the filibuster, at least laws would be passed. As it is, the Senate passes almost nothing, leaving most policy to the White House or the Supreme Court if it gets there. If the U.S. is to be prevented from sliding into autocracy via executive consolidation, the Senate filibuster must go, and if it will not, the Senate must go. This institution, as it currently operates, is, without exaggeration, ruinous to the country. And if it is not changed, there will be little chance of avoiding autocracy. You may question why laws need to be passed, and the answer is obviously that some problems can only be solved through the force of the state, and it will not do to simply stand around saying, we can't. When the stumbling block to political action is not lack of will or intent, not some law of nature, it is hardly unreasonable to expect those with the power to do as the public wishes to get off their asses and do so. Yet the procedures of the Senate preclude the will of even a majority of states, let alone people, from being manifested. And given it is not practically possible to get it to change, either internally, procedurally, or externally, constitutionally, is it really reasonable to tell people, sorry, the rules are the Senate has to pass it with 60 votes or we can never, ever, ever enact this policy? I would say no. This is procedural horse shit getting in the way of the government being representative. What does getting to vote really matter in this context, where the votes of most of the population are invalidated by a minority of obstructionists? This inherently conservative, high-threshold legislating presumes that change is more likely to be worse than no change. It presumes that present conditions are satisfactory. It is not a system that can cope with problems which lack overwhelming consensus as to their solution. The government cannot even make an attempt and leave the judgment of their efforts to the electorate at the next election. The opposition can just shut it down in the Senate before it can even be tried. It is no wonder that all anyone cares about are presidential elections, and that few truly cared about the consolidation of presidential power over the last century. The president, being the head honcho of the executive branch, is the only one with the ability to actually do anything, policy-wise. He can't make laws, but he can issue executive orders that cause the federal bureaucracy and state apparatus to follow his prescriptions for as long as he is in office, basically creating law by management rather than legislation. This is a dangerous consolidation of power when combined with the president's dictatorial authority over the military, as in he can attack anyone he wants, and unlimited power of pardon, meaning he can effectively break the law at will and only removing him from office via impeachment can stop him. But it is the only vehicle left within their current system that allows for the inaction of a policy agenda. I can sit here all day and criticize Trump's agenda ideologically, and I will, but I can no longer reasonably take issue with the methodology. A sufficiently left-wing POTUS to suit my tastes would have to do the same, as otherwise nothing would ever change. This is a problem that can only be solved in two ways within the current system, both by changing the character of the electorate. Either ending the filibuster must become a priority issue, one that candidates must align with in order to be elected to the Senate at all, or they must become so overwhelmingly supportive of one party that they consistently give that party 60 Senate seats. Both of these, especially the latter, are exceedingly unlikely, but the only other options are to accept the slide into de facto dictatorship or to throw out the current system altogether and design a more functional one from the ground up, a blank slate revolution of some kind. But I don't want to normalize those last two. The system would have worked if there were no filibuster or any way to create one. Put aside whether the Senate should even exist. If there were no filibuster, laws would regularly pass, and there would be no push to offload policymaking onto the president instead. The easiest solution to this problem in theory, is to make ending the filibuster an issue voters will base their votes on, in order to elect a Senate that will abolish the filibuster. In practice, however, most people do not care that much about matters of government procedure. They just have an idea of what they want the government to do, and don't care that much how that happens. Trying to get everyone to care more about ending the filibuster than anything else, when the president can simply bypass them under current precedent, is a tall order simply because people are bad at long-term thinking and won't be cognizant of the consequences of concentrating presidential power like that until it's too late.